September 9th, 2025. Doha, Qatar. The desert night was still, heavy with heat. Glass towers shimmered against the Gulf, neon lights dancing across spotless roads. Families finished late dinners in high-rise apartments. Along the Corniche, cars hummed beneath street lamps. Doha wasn't a battlefield. Doha was the back room, the safe city, the place where wars came to negotiate in whispers. At 9:13 p.m., that illusion shattered. A white flash ripped open the skyline. A thunderclap followed, rattling windows across West Bay. Car alarms screamed. Seconds later, another blast rolled through the towers. Glass rained from balconies. Plumes of black smoke climbed above a city that was never supposed to burn. Israel had struck Hamas leadership in Doha, and the world gasped. Inside a guarded residential block, men sat around low tables, papers scattered with draft ceasefire terms. They believed Doha was untouchable, a fortress of diplomacy where they could breathe. Then the room convulsed. Walls flexed, lights died, and a heat wave slammed across the floor. The strike was surgical, but surgery still cuts. Shards flew like daggers. A sidewall disintegrated into grit. Voices became static, then shouting. In the Leg Taifaya district, residents stepped onto balconies with phones already recording, the camera sensors struggling against smoke and sodium light. Sirens approached in serrated waves. A woman dragged her son away from a window carpeted in glass teeth. A security guard pressed his hand to a bleeding brow and kept ushering people into stairwells. "Move, move! Down, not up!" he said louder each time to drown the horns and alarms. Hamas announced its senior leader survived. 5 members did not. A Qatari security officer would not go home. For a city built on the promise of safety, it was the first true taste of fire. Ambulances weaved through traffic. Police redirected cars with quick, decisive gestures. One officer's gloved hand shook only after he waved the last sedan away. Families clustered in stairwells, children with headphones over their ears, adults whispering the same question, "Is there more coming?" In lobby corners, hotel staff handed out bottles of water and thin towels that smelled faintly of bleach. Downtown's glass can make you feel rich. Tonight it made everyone feel brittle. Within minutes, Israeli officials signaled that the operation had targeted Hamas's political leadership, nodes that, in their view, authorized violence elsewhere. Israel offered almost nothing about methods, the way special operations like to leave only a silhouette. Doha's prime minister called the strike treacherous and vowed legal action. He also promised mediation would not stop. He said it twice, like a wall being rebuilt while smoke still curled from the bricks. Across the ocean, phones lit the faces of tired people in windowless rooms. American officials admitted later that the warning came only minutes before impact. No approval, no coordination, just a note sliding under a locked door. The White House said it was very unhappy about a strike in Doha, and then tried to thread 3 needles at once: protect an ally, preserve a partnership, keep a path to an eventual ceasefire alive. You can juggle 3 plates. You can't juggle 3 grenades after the pins are out. Doha's leaders called Cairo, Ankara, Washington. Security services widened the cordon. Drones stitched a quiet grid over the city, lenses peering down through heat haze and smoke. Lawyers drafted statements in rooms that smelled like espresso and printer toner. But the most important calls were not press lines. They were the back-channel numbers that had settled swaps and pauses and improbable deals. The switchboard of diplomacy was still lit, but one of its rooms was scorched. The blast did not echo only through glass. They moved through policy. Israel's message was blunt. Nowhere is safe for orchestrators. Hamas's message was defiant. We survived. You failed. Qatar's message was sovereign. Our capital is not a hunting ground. The UN's message arrived in formal language that still stung. A flagrant breach. And the American message, wrapped in caution, said what timing had already shouted: allies act on their own clocks. Emergency crews pulled at concrete with gloves gone gray. A paramedic tucked a child-stuffed camel into a blanket before lifting the boy. On a nearby balcony, a father filmed the skyline with hands that would not stop shaking. In an underground garage, a hotel concierge guided guests to a quieter corner. then whispered into her radio that an elderly man needed his medication from a room on the 22nd floor. Ordinary people became logistics officers for their own safety. Urban precision is a paradox. To hit a suite in a tower without tearing the city means intelligence gathered for weeks. Patterns of arrival and departure sketched into certainty. Choices about angles and timings and warheads that trade one risk for another. Tonight's impacts look tight, the damage envelope slim by the awful standards of war. But precision does not mean harmless. A clean cut still bleeds. A presenter repeated the same sentence 3 times. Not for drama, but because the earpiece kept failing. Analysts flipped maps between Gaza and Doha and asked what line had moved. Comment threads filled with people arguing about sovereignty and strategy and whether diplomacy should ever be allowed to become a shield. Somewhere between the shouting, a woman posted a video of her kitchen clock knocked from the wall. It still ticked in the frame. Second-hand tea. By midnight, the first wide shots of the facade appeared. A ribcage of concrete, rooms open like stage sets, a bed tilted toward the open air. Tape fluttered at the edges of police barriers. The smell, hot metal, broken wiring, a sweetness you never want to recognize, settled into the alleys. In a nearby clinic, a nurse wiped soot from a little girl's cheek with a gauze pad and told a story about a cat that sleeps through storms. The girl smiled because people offered her reasons to. In Washington, the statement was sanded again and sent. In Tel Aviv, officials stayed away from details and near the principal. In Doha, the prime minister spoke slowly, measured but metallic, a voice that knows the difference between anger that plays well and anger that builds anything back. He said Qatar would pursue legal steps. He said mediation was a matter of identity. He said this night would not change that. But everyone understood that something else had changed. Confidence is the fuel of negotiations, and it burns easily. You can replace glass in a week. Replacing the feeling that rooms are safe takes longer. The map of risk expanded by inches you can't draw, corridors you can't label, conversations that from now on will happen in different buildings at different hours with different protocols. A driver will take an extra turn before pulling to a curb. A meeting will start later because the security sweep takes 15 minutes more. A negotiator will speak 2 decibels softer when discussing locations, even in rooms with white noise hissing from the ceiling. And the city learned new choreography. People stopped beneath overhangs when a helicopter drummed past. Shopkeepers swept up glass with the same rhythm as every morning, only slower around the edges. Parents kept children from touching the glittering shards stuck in planter soil. The corniche resumed its nightly glide, but brakes flashed a half-second sooner at every intersection. Doha moved as cities do, and remembered as cities must. By dawn, the smoke had thinned to a brown veil. Birds returned to lines where they had not dared land. Somewhere, a coffee grinder screamed into beans, and a baker slid trays from an oven because ordinary is the one flag people always try to raise after a night like this. But even ordinary had a new seam stitched through it. You could feel it in the way elevator doors paused before closing, in the way conversations bent around the name of the district, in the way every car radio kept the volume 1 notch lower than before, and yet the air still felt charged. Urban precision strikes are supposed to be cold equations. Angles of attack, yield of munitions, surveillance feeds stacked against probability charts. But war in a city is never only geometry. It is the father carrying his son down 12 flights of stairs barefoot. It is the student replaying the explosion on her phone until her hand shakes. It is the guard who pressed his shoulder against a broken door frame so strangers could pass. Precision might limit damage, but it does not cancel fear. The messages of the night hardened with daylight. To Hamas, you are not beyond reach, not even here. To Qatar, your role as mediator does not make you immune. To the wider region, red lines are dissolving. To Washington, allies act on their own clocks. And to the world, backrooms can become front lines without warning. Each message was delivered not in speeches, but in the silence of burned walls and the smell of scorched wiring. In Geneva, diplomats drafted statements. In New York, the United Nations repeated words like flagrant violation and urgent restraint. In Cairo, negotiators shuffled papers that had been on the table only hours earlier, now smudged with irrelevance. And in Doha, families taped cardboard across windows while their government weighed how to respond without tearing its identity in two. Because Qatar's pride has always been tied to its role as the negotiator, the small state that could balance giants. If that role was undermined, Doha itself would feel smaller in the eyes of the world. Qatar announced it would pursue legal steps. The Prime Minister's words were careful, but his tone carried steel. He insisted mediation would not stop. But mediation is not built on promises alone. It is built on confidence, and confidence had been cracked. Each envoy now had to ask a silent question before entering a room. Would the next missile follow them inside? Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, Israeli officials framed the operation as necessity. They said no leader of Hamas should expect safe haven anywhere. In Gaza, Hamas presented survival as victory, broadcasting defiance to its followers. For them, the attack was proof that even assassination attempts could not erase their leadership. Competing narratives collided in headlines and hashtags, but behind them lay the raw truth. A diplomatic capital had been turned into a battlefield in a single night. In Washington, officials walked a tightrope stretched too thin. They admitted the U.S. had been warned but not consulted. They repeated that the strike was unfortunate, but stopped short of open condemnation. America could not afford to alienate Israel, nor could it risk losing Qatar's cooperation as a mediator. So they chose the only path left, ambiguity. But ambiguity does not erase the facts. The bombs had already written their story in fire. For the people of Doha, the consequences were not debates in press rooms, but the sound of hammers the next morning. Crews nailed boards across fractured facades. Sweepers pushed glittering shards into bins that overflowed before noon. Shops reopened, but every glance upward at the skyline carried a shadow. It was not the loss of life alone, it was the loss of innocence. The belief that Doha, of all places, was untouchable had vanished overnight. The incident also redrew invisible maps. Routes that had once been routine suddenly seemed vulnerable. Meeting halls once considered secure were now suspect. Even the air above Doha felt thinner, less certain, as if the city had moved a few degrees closer to the conflict it had only hosted until now. Diplomacy would continue, but its stage had been scorched. Qatar's options were laid out like cards on a table, each carrying a cost. Hardened mediation, doubling down on talks even while pursuing legal action, would preserve identity but invite more risk. Quiet escalation through visas, finance, or diplomatic pressure could send signals without explosions. Accepting that Israel now saw political offices as operational nodes meant living with new dangers. Or Doha could seek to re-architect ceasefire talks with Cairo and Washington, adding new guarantees, new monitors, new precautions. And in the meantime, Hamas would claim survival, Israel would claim justice, and Qatar would claim sovereignty. The battle for narrative had already begun. For ordinary people, the choices of governments mattered less than the choices of the next hour. Should they send their children to school? Should they keep them home? Should they trust that lightning does not strike the same place twice? Or fear that precision makes it easier to strike again? Each family weighed its own risks, its own hope for a normal day, and each knew that normal had been rewritten. By evening, as the sun sank behind the skyline, the scars of the strike were still visible. Scaffolding clinging to broken towers, police tape fluttering in the hot breeze, reporters standing in front of blackened facades repeating the same words. The city's heart still beat, but it beat faster, heavier, aware now of its own fragility. When diplomacy is attacked, diplomacy becomes a weapon. Doha was supposed to be untouchable. On September 9, 2025, it became the front line. The strike did not just kill, it shifted confidence, redrew lines, and reminded the world that nowhere is truly safe. And the question that now hangs over every capital is simple. Who will strike next and where? This was not just another strike, it was a declaration. It reminded the world that even the quietest capitals are within reach of fire. If you want frontline stories told like this, humanized, cinematic, and anchored to real events, subscribe. Because this war isn't just about Gaza or Israel, or Hamas. It's about the entire map of diplomacy. And now even the mediators aren't safe.